This is Openwork, a look inside the watch industry, a podcast from Collective Horology. I'm Gabe Reilly, co-founder of Collective.
And I'm Asher Rapkin, co-founder of Collective.
Collective Horology is an independent watch retailer based in Southern California. We carry a wide range of independent brands, including Chapek, Garrick, Singer Reimagined, and more. To learn more about us and check out our available inventory, visit collectivehorology.com.
So I'd like to welcome you to episode 10 of the Openwork podcast. Before we go any further, I want to give a massive thank you to everyone listening and to all of you who have taken the time to share this podcast with your friends and given us comments and feedback. We appreciate you. Today on Openwork, we are going to talk about what happens when a founder leaves a brand. From Daniel Roth to Speake-Marin, there are examples of this all over the industry, with some interesting, if varied, results. We are thrilled to have one of our oldest friends, clients, and dare we say, an authority on the independent watchmaking scene join us. I first met Roman through eBay, of all places, almost 8 years ago when selling some esoteric watches from my personal collection, and the friendship grew from there. If you don't know Roman, you might recognize him from his podcast, Independent Thinking, or his Instagram account, TimesRomanAU, where Roman posts about, among other things, deep-cut independence and supports the vibrant Australian watch community he helped to found, Fifth Wrist. Roman's dry wit and humor are no match for his extensive knowledge about independence, and he's provided us with feedback, opinions, and support over the years as Collective has grown. We think he's the perfect guest to join us to tackle today's topic, so let's kick it off with a hello. Roman, welcome to Openwork.
Oh, thank you so much. That was a wonderful, wonderful introduction. Ill-deserved, but thank you. I'll take the compliments.
Oh, well, as a professional marketer, I spin nonsense for a living, so it's something I take great pride in.
You did beautifully. And also, there's a fine line between dry wit and desiccated humor, so I'm glad I'm just on that side of it. But no, it's an absolute pleasure to join you and Gabe. Big fan.
Well, thank you. And I would be remiss in not pointing out that one of the very first podcasts that I was invited to join was yours. So how the tables have turned, as it were. Welcome. I want to dive in right to the topic. Let's start with the basics. One of the hallmarks of independent watchmaking is the idea that the name on the dial was directly involved in, if not directly responsible for, the watch it adorns. As somebody who is both an independent collector and somebody who has, over the last few years, had the pleasure of speaking with countless independent watchmakers, I'd love it if you could talk a little bit about that. And from a personal standpoint, I'm curious just to understand, why do you think that matters?
It's a really big and interesting topic. And, I'm aware that I'm speaking to two professional marketers who are much better and much smarter about these things than I am. So I will try and give you sort of my perspective on it. So names are funny because they both matter and they don't matter. Right? So once we are familiar with a brand, the name becomes just a thing you associate with the brand. The classic example of this would be something like IWC, which by all measures is a terrible name. It's a name a CIA would use to hide their operations in a country, right? I mean, it's just international watch. It's a terrible name, but we don't care about it because when we think of IWC, we associate it with big pilot, or if you're into Nazi flying, or you're in Portuguese, or if you like, early Ukrainian traveling with commerce, or whatever the thing is, you have a picture in your mind, right, of IWC. So from that perspective, names don't matter. On the other hand, if you are an independent maker, your name is essentially your only tradable commodity when you start out. So, and once again, the interesting thing that would be, I always think of something like Regepi versus Akrivia, right? So when Akrivia was Akrivia, that requires a degree of additional explanation. Who is behind this? What are they trying to do? What's their ethnic background? Who are they? If you're Regepi and you got, cojones to put your name on the dial, that instantly says, this is me, this is what I do. So it bypasses a lot of the explanation. So from that point of view, I think this is where names do matter. But ultimately, either can work, I guess. For me personally, when you say, does it matter to me? I like to know that the name on the dial is connected to the watch that is produced. But that actually, I think, places additional burdens on the maker to actually be either making it or directly driving the idea behind the brand. The maker has to be really firmly connected to the name on the dial. And from that point of view, I think that matters to me, that there is a connection, whether it's making or thinking a concept or something directly related to the human element.
I kind of segment when a brand name or a name on a watch matters and doesn't matter into these three sort of categories or these three segments. So segment one, and this is really over time. Segment one is brands where the founder or the name on the dial is currently involved in the business exactly in the way you were just describing, Roman. So that would be Reilly. The name is on the dial. It's the brand name. He's very obviously involved in the business. There are countless examples. Then there would be a second segment I would call out. The second segment would be brands who have survived or evolved past that. So IWC is a great example. Mr. Jones is no longer involved in the business. He's long dead. Hans Wilsdorf is long dead. The brand has survived. It's out of the period where the person who founded the brand and was identified with the brand matters. Now, those are both examples of people founders whose names aren't on the dial of a watch. There are plenty of examples where that is the case. Patek Philippe is a very easy one, obviously. Mr. Patek and Mr. Philippe are no longer here. The brand continues on, and it's not even a thing where we just even think about really the founders, or the brand takes on a life of its own. It's come to mean something beyond the people who founded the brand. Then there's this third segment, and this third segment would be in between. These are brands that are transitioning from that first segment to that second segment. So in other words, the brand has a name on the dial or has a founder who's closely identified with the brand who is transitioning out or is no longer a part of the brand. So an easy example there would be Parmigiani Fleurier, right? Michael Parmigiani has formally transitioned, but is still involved in the brand to some extent at large. Asher, you mentioned Speake-Marin. That's another example. Peter Speake is no longer involved in the brand, and the brand is finding its footing and figuring out what it sort of stands for beyond his direct involvement in the brand. And that's, I think, where, there's a lot of really interesting conversation we can have, because the brands that have the owner or the founder whose name is on the dial, who's involved in the business, that's easy. We all want to root for the watchmaker, the founder, the person who's involved in the business. Knowing, we talked to Thomas Fleming on our last episode, the founder of Fleming, and he explained to us he decided to use his name as the brand name, not because of vanity. He wanted to do everything he possibly could to avoid it, but because it signaled to people who were investing in a new brand that there was someone behind it. There was someone who was accountable and stood for it, and that provided a level of reassurance. And I love your point about Reilly. It's like, it's a shorthand, right? There's a guy who's the watchmaker. I get it. It's very straightforward. That's really easy to understand. And we all sort of want to root for the people behind a watchmaking brand. What I think is really interesting are these brands that are trying to navigate and move from this period of being identified with a founder to surviving. Now, we can all go to a local watch store and walk by all the names and all the different showcases, and we can see all these brands, whether it's Breguet or IWC or Rolex, the list goes on, that have survived and have flourished past the involvement of their original founder. But there's a bit of survivorship bias there. This is not a foregone conclusion. And I'm sure there is a graveyard of brands that did not successfully survive this transition. So I guess one thing I'd like to get your perspective on is, what does it take for a brand to survive that transition? What happens in this phase where an owner moves on or transitions out or passes away or whatever it is? And then how does a brand go from there? How does it navigate that period successfully? Because that is a really sort of fraught thing from a creative and a business standpoint.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, really good points. Also, I quite like your visual of going to a watch store and walking past a lot of the display cases. I think people should definitely do that, particularly if you're walking past a Rolex. Absolutely. Just keep walking.
You had to slip the anti-Rolex thing.
I have a contract. I have to absolutely dump on Rolex at every opportunity. But sorry, I do get distracted easily. Key question. Like, I think, Gabe, you put your finger right on it. Like, I think that is the gray zone is really interesting. In my mind, it ultimately depends on what kind of independent watch brand you as the maker want to be. But the ultimate difference in my mind is, are you going artisanal versus are you trying to conquer the world and be a large brand, right? So, for example, if we think about an independent brand like F. Pigeon, for example, right? That's a large brand, and the aspiration has been, or at least is now, to be long-term, sustainable, beyond the maker's name. And we make 1,000 watches, whatever the number is, but we want to be here way longer. Versus a brand that actually just wants to reflect the maker's identity, time they live in, interest they want to do, and is really just looking at capturing a moment in time. That's what I think of artisanal. So I must confess, the artisanal brands are always more interesting to me because I see them as really much more compelling, both in terms of buying now and also buying in the future, because I think we're trying to capture lightning in a bottle. Who is the exciting maker now? What are they thinking, doing now? And what are they trying to do to make the year, whatever year we're in, 2024, why are they doing this at this point in time? To me, that's really interesting. Very few brands manage the transition, independent brands manage the transition out beyond the life of the maker, or at least, not necessarily life, but involvement of the maker, because the maker is often the innovating spirit of the idea of the brand. And as soon as the maker leaves, suddenly people holding the brand going, okay, great. What do we do next year? Do we just go the same but a blue dial, or the same? Oh, Tiffany's selling. There's the kind of flurry of activity because nobody actually understands why they do what they do.
Forgive me for interrupting, but you're reminding me of a point that we brought up on a podcast a few episodes ago, which was about the power of brand in watchmaking. And I think, Gabe, you pointed out in that episode that a lot of independent makers tend to be a little, how should I put it, taken aback, if you will, at the concept of thinking of their manufacturer as a brand. That it was almost antithetical to be a brand, right? So if Asher Rapkin makes watches and I put Asher Rapkin on the dial, that's really an indicator of me, my style, my vision, and my overall belief about watchmaking, not Asher Rapkin LLC Incorporated, what have you. But as we talk about this, one of the interesting, and I want to get deeper into this point about like where a individual watchmaker with a particular vision evolves into a manufacturer and therefore evolves into a brand. But some of those things are decisions, right? Like Max Busser, for example, has made it very clear that he has a succession plan. We're getting a little ahead of ourselves in our topic here, but he's made it clear that MB&F will, at the very least, have plans for how to service their watches, but may very well have plans for how to continue the brand after he departs. But the many watchmakers, I think, because they are scared of their name turning into a brand, as it were, may very well, if we follow through with the line of thought here, be almost cutting themselves off at the knee. Because once they're gone, they're gone. Now, you could look at that in one of two ways. You could say, all right, if Roman makes watches and he made 150 watches in his lifetime, and that's how many watches he made, and that's it, then there is a certain finite beauty to that, that was it. But the flip side of that is when you take that sort of abstraction away, there's 150 people out there who have watches which are unserviceable, which are just floating out. I want to get into that. You're shaking your head no for those who can't see me, but maybe unserviceable. There's a whole side conversation here about watchmakers having the ability to actually service something versus being those who assemble. But I want to come back to that. At the very least, there's anxiety can we agree to that? There will be anxiety on the part of the 150 people who invested in that watch. And then there's a broader question too, which is, say, if somebody poured their whole life's work into making 150 of something that had something unique to say, is there not a greater potential down the road to continue to develop that? And can that go beyond just make it blue or make it pink or make it red? Which I think opens up sort of a second line of conversation, which I'd like to explore too, which is a lot of people who start watch companies are watchmakers, but there's also people who start watch companies who are not watchmakers, who are watch designers. And, if you so I'll give two parallel examples. You brought up F. Pigeon. He's absolutely a watchmaker. He also had a very clear aesthetic vision of what he wanted to create. And then you have someone like Ming, who is not a watchmaker, but has a very clear idea of aesthetically what his brand represents. Both of those are very strong brands in their own right. Both of those have planted a flag around what they're doing. But one could argue that Ming may have a longer term succession plan than Journe, because Ming has a lot more flexibility in the way that his watches are made versus a guy like FP Journe, where everybody expects that, the air within the manufacturer was recycled from the man himself. And therefore there's a certain bit of magic associated with it. So I wonder, there's a lot in what I just said, I realize, but I wonder, like, let's take a look at designer versus actual watchmaker. Do you think that one of those has more legs or gives a brand more protection once the owner departs in whatever method they depart? Or is it a different way that we should be thinking about it or looking at it?
I don't think there's a difference between if the founder is a maker versus a designer. It doesn't matter, because it's still ultimately they are directing what gets made, why it gets made, what's the story behind it. So that's fine. If you're a designer like Ming, you essentially use somebody else's hands to execute your vision. That's fine. Like, no problem. Don't have any issue with that. As long as it's clear, obviously, as long as it's clearly communicated and everyone knows that's what the story is, no problem. Like, Godspeed, go and work your magic, right? So I don't think that gives that gives a brand any more longevity or protection, whether you're a maker or a designer. Both have a finite, in my mind, they have a finite expiration date. I am on record saying I want to see more brands sail beyond the end of the maker's life. I like to see a chapter concluded, because the way I see independent making, and we think of independent watchmaker, thinking here of artisanal independent watchmaking, where the maker had a clear idea. I like to see, I see it as art, right? And ultimately, only the watch industry seems to have this real story and anxiety about getting things serviced. I don't hear somebody looking at a Jackson Pollock painting for sale at a gallery saying, yeah, I'm not sure if I buy this, who is going to touch up this thing if the canvas goes a bit red.
But that's not a fair comparison, because a Jackson Pollock has no moving parts. There's no, right? I mean, like cleaning a canvas is not the same thing as servicing a mechanical.
I would argue, in many ways it's worse. I mean, you hear stories of particularly the Impressionists, all these poor artists painting on really crappy canvases with makeshift stretchers 200 years ago. And they've been hanging on walls in damp European castles or under Allied or Luftwaffe bombardment in World War II. So, and you hear stories of somebody putting a finger through their Picasso because they were leaning. There was some American restaurateur, I think, did that. So, and, we were fortunate enough to have Todd Levin on our podcast a while ago. Todd's an amazing man. He talked about, when we asked him about the challenge of upkeep and all that. So I think the expertise required to maintain a premier painting is in no way less easy than maintaining a watch. And, I've got a couple of pocket watches here from, 200 years ago, 1810 Arnold chronometer ticking away, keeping to a minute a day, 220 years from now. Everything is ultimately serviceable. Not everything, but a lot of things are ultimately serviceable, particularly if they're made with, materials and all that. But we can talk about the future serviceability and what the responsibility of a brand is doing interesting or novel things like HYT, for example. When they do finish, there is an obligation, I think, on the maker's part to make that information available. But having said that, I don't see serviceability, long-term serviceability, as anxiety. I also see it much more compelling. If there is let's say, Asher and Gabe, you guys started making watches and you had this really interesting idea. You created something really special, right? And you put it out into the world. When you finish, let's say there's 150 watches out there, I think it's marvelous. Don't need any more, because if I discover your brand 50 years down the line after you finished making, you could still be alive, hopefully, but if you finished making, it's much more interesting to me to go, hey, between 2024 and 2037, these two crazy guys did this really cool thing. There's only 150 of them. It takes a real effort to get them. But once you have them, so much more special, so much more compelling.
Okay, so if we're to summarize this, because I think the last 20 minutes or so of conversation really revolves around like one really key point, which is an interesting one, which is that one could argue that if somebody has a novel point of view, that there being a finite number of examples that have brought that finite point of view to life is in and of itself a beautiful thing. And I think I see that both from a business standpoint and an artistic standpoint. So then I want to pose a sort of more rhetorical question, going back to an insight that you brought up, which I think is really interesting, Roman, which is like the watch industry is uniquely interested in the perseverance of legacy. Now, let's explore that a little bit, right? Because that says if we tease out, and I realize this is a little bit of a ridiculous example, but if we tease out what you said, if Picasso had been Picasso LLC and they continued to produce, or someone continued to produce Picasso's so artwork in the style of Picasso, if you will. And as I say this, I realize how ridiculous this sounds. You know, what would that look like? Now, I realize that the parallel between watches and fine art may seem tenuous to some, but, you know, to others, it might be equivalent. Like I invest way more in watches than I do in fine art. So that's an art form that I really admire. So you could make a similar argument, but I don't view it as ridiculously as I would if someone said, this is a 2024 Monet Incorporated Monet versus the one that I see hanging in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. So that's a really interesting thing to explore. Now, obviously, the watch industry is an industry, which is different than purely artistic endeavors where value is placed on something because of scarcity, artistic interest, or what have you. But, you know, I don't know that artists necessarily approach, and maybe they do, I don't know much about this, but maybe I don't know that artists approach the creation of art in the same way that watchmakers do from a commercial standpoint. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. But it does sort of beg a fascinating question, and one that I want to keep in our mind as we sort of progress through here, which is, as weird as that as weird as that analogy is, you know, the reality is that watchmaking, at least in the modern form, is an industry and is a business. So in this modern day, somebody who has invested however much of their life and however much of their finance into the development and the execution of their work may wish to see it succeed so that their family or their friends or their clients or what have you continue to be able to see the benefit of that creation. So if we continue down that road, I want to look at where independents can succeed in succession and what we worry about in terms of where they can fail. So we touched a little bit on your point of view on servicing, which is interesting. I'd like to take a look at, and we can pick any brand here. You know, it could be Breguet, it could be Speake, it could be any numbers, but where the founder is gone. In the case of Speake-Marin, obviously the founder is very much alive, but in the case of Breguet, you know, is very much dead. But you know, Breguet, for example, appears to be, at least in all modern incarnations, rather obsessed with staying pretty true to the creative tropes of the original watchmaker, relatively speaking. You know, Speake-Marin, as a modern example, has stepped outside of the lines of what Peter originally defined. There's certainly elements of the brand that are still there, and you know, and full transparency, obviously, we're Speake-Marin retailers, so we have a point of view about this. But just speaking about it just openly, you know, there are elements of modern Speake-Marin which I don't know that Peter would have ever investigated himself. But there are also elements of modern Speake-Marin which lean very heavily on Peter's aesthetics and watchmaking. So I guess I'm curious, if we assume that these brands are going to continue, what are the things that they can do that actually would continue to provide creative and artistic interest? Like if you think about, like Roman, like if you think about this and you say, all right, if this is going to go on, if after Max retires or passes and MB&F continues, what would make MB&F successful and interesting outside of him, rather than just carbon copying LM101s and printing them in every color of the rainbow? What is there that is interesting to explore post-founder?
I don't know. Genuinely, it's a great question, and I don't know. And I think the bigger problem is often when that happens, the people who take over the brand don't know either. Because the problem is, if we take MB&F as a really interesting example, because they're very diverse in their, because they really reflect the interests of their creator from, horological machines, anyway, you know the idea. It's going to be very hard because if when Max hands it over to somebody, family member, friend, it actually doesn't matter. It's going to be really, really hard for them because unless they do iterations of the existing, in which case it becomes much less interesting if the person who thought of these is not there anymore, much less interesting. But if they go pursue really novel idea, the thing is always going to be, well, you might as well just put your own name on the dial and just do your own thing. Well, why are you piggybacking on the previous without making anything in the canon?
Okay, I'll give you an example from a brand that I know you absolutely adore, as mentioned earlier, Rolex. So if we think about Hans Wilsdorf and what he wanted to accomplish, and I putting aside any positive or negative bias here, like clearly what the man wanted to create was a everyday effective, high quality, robust tool watch that was waterproof.
Great watch.
If we boil it all the way down,
great
right?
Watches. Without a burst to say.
And I think if we compare what, say, a Rolex bubbleback looked like from the 1930s to a titanium Yachtmaster today, there is a consistent through line there, even if even if pricing and inflation and all of that, like if we take all of that away, like there is a through line there. And one could argue that within the sort of narrow constraints of what Rolex's design, and this is true for IWC too, I would argue, within the narrow constraints of the design language, that there's still a lot to explore there that might be of interest. And, one thing that I love, for example, if we look at IWC, is how Christian, their current head of design, has looked at some of their more experimental pieces and borrowed elements of the design while pushing the overall technicality. And that, in general, I find to be a really exciting and interesting element, which really... now that I'm saying this, brings out almost a really fascinating rhetorical question, which is modern Rolex or modern IWC an homage brand to the original, in a sense? And effectively, what you're basically buying when you think about a post-founder long-term, and this is, I'm asking what you guys think about this. Like, if you buy into like the core concept of a brand, can someone effectively create, something that is in service to that brand in the long term that still finds new territory that is interesting to explore within the vernacular and the strategy of that brand, but not in the original voice of it? So if we go to Breguet, for example, the tradition is something that I love. I love the tradition line of Breguet. Like, that borrows a lot of heavy winks and nods towards the original subscription pocket watches, although it's clearly not anything that the original man would have made. But it is clearly made in his voice and in his image and as an homage to what he did. And it's really cool. It's interesting stuff. Now, you could say, did that have to be made under the Breguet name? Could that have also been made under anyone else who just is borrowing from that aesthetic? When does the Breguet name on the dial help it or hinder it? I don't know, but I also wonder, if that homage status, if you will, of the modern brand doesn't provide additional value for those who are alive today to be able to reinterpret it or find something new in it. It's kind of like, and this is again a kind of a weird metaphor to use, but it's kind of like how people reinterpret modern Shakespeare. Like, you could keep performing Shakespeare the exact way that it was performed at the Globe hundreds of years ago, or you could completely reinvent it using the same words, but a completely different artistic vision. And there's still new ground to be discovered there.
Sure.
So one could argue that under the Shakespeare brand, people are still producing, I'm serious, like under the Shakespeare brand, like people are still producing new product that is interesting, but borrows from the tropes defined by the man himself.
Sure, absolutely. But I think we are kind of confusing two different things here. So there is a difference between a brand that's designed like the Hans Wilsdorf style, mass-produced, this is going to be an everyday watch for everyday man, woman, child. So it has to appeal to everyone, and we have to make a lot of them, and we have to find the price where we can saturate the market and segment it and layer it and make sure that there's one of these for every person, right? Versus the artisanal craftsperson doing something to express their idea in a small way. Completely different. Everything's actually completely different. The scale, what you're trying to achieve, who you're trying to appeal, how edgy you can be, all of that. There's a reason why Max makes, I don't know, 200 watches a year, whatever, versus 25,000 watches a year, because he can't be full Max, if we can put that in inverted commas, at 25,000 units. Even if he could produce them, I'm not sure he could find enough people to buy them at that price. So that there is a difference, or what the audience you're trying to reach. So there is a difference between a person now buying a Mercedes-Benz, right? Buying it because it's a modern Mercedes-Benz, not because it pays homage to Carl Benz of, I don't know, 1825 or whatever the year was. I'm not into car. They're completely different idea. They're
1825,
whatever I don't know. But whatever there is a difference. So, and I think many an independent watchmaker failed at exactly as a brand at exactly that moment, where they forgot that they actually had a unique point that really had a particular limit or ceiling to who they were trying to appeal, and suddenly went, hey, this is going well. Why don't I just make 10 times more of these? Think of the cash revenue I could get. And suddenly they realize, well, hang on, no, actually, as soon as you do that, you're actually playing in a different ball pen, and you actually have, even if we don't take staffing required in manufacturing, just in terms of appealing, being yourself is really hard at a bigger scale.
That's interesting. I never thought about it that way. I think a key fork in the road for a lot of these brands navigating this transition we're describing is scalability, right? So if I go back to my original example, you're walking through the watch retailer, you see all these brands, and they all, put the year they were founded locked up with their logo since whenever, right?
Yeah.
And I think what you see there, like one, I mentioned there's some survivorship bias. Like, of course, these, you look at these brands and you say, well, of course, a watchmaker or a watchmaking brand can survive beyond the founder. Look at all these examples. But I think in these examples, there's this point, which is there was some scalability to what was being done there. So in the example of Rolex, you described it well. Like Rolex makes very commercial, well-made watches that are easy to understand and well-designed. In the case of IWC, same thing. Like there's a scalability to that idea and to that business model and to that product. Even Abraham Louis Breguet, obviously you're right, Asher, those watches are very true to the original. However, so much of Breguet's watchmaking and design language is so omnipresent in the watch world that there's a real scalability to honoring the legacy of Abraham Louis Breguet. Now, when we talk a lot of the smaller independent brands, Roman, which you're right, are really an expression of a particular creator's point of view. And they reach this inflection point and this fork in the road where they're like, the founder is leaving, or the founder is moving on to something else, or has passed away, or whatever it is. You're right. Maybe they need to take a hard look in the mirror and ask themselves, is what we have here fundamentally an artistic expression of someone's point of view? And once they're gone, it's going to be really hard to know what to do, right? Or is there a scalability to what this person stands for or has created or has made, or a potential for it to be very scalable, so that it's almost like the future inevitably writes itself. We know where we would go with this. It's clear how extensible this is. So I wonder, I can think of one example of a brand that's really struggling with this now. I wonder if there are successful examples, but I'll give you an example of a brand that's struggling with this now. We've talked about it in the podcast, Bremont. Bremont has reached a point where the original founders of the brand have moved on, and the circumstances around the business have changed. And they've looked, I think you could argue maybe they're actually doing the right thing here, because you could argue they looked themselves in the mirror and they said, is what Nick and Giles created here, as special as it is, and I love the watches from Bremont's sort of first chapter,
Yeah, I agree.
is what Nick and Giles have created here truly extensible and scalable as a business? Or do we need to take a different tact? Do we need for Bremont to continue to exist as a business into the future? Do we need to look at a model? Do we need to look at watchmaking? Do we need to look at a brand that's going to be more extensible and more scalable? And I think we could argue about how well they're executing on that strategy, but you could argue this is a brand that's at that inflection point, at that fork in the road, and they've recognized it's not going to be enough to just continue with what the founders of the brand have done. They're going to need to do something that has more scale.
Listening to you guys talk about this, I'm thinking about a parallel from a former life I had, which is in tech. And I used to work at Apple, and I joined Apple about, 10 months or so after Steve Jobs died. Mm-hmm. And Apple was a company that, growing up in the 90s as the dorky kid that I was and grew up to be.
Wait, you were a dork in the 90s? I had no idea.
Oh, yes.
And you were there as well, Gabe.
So anyway, what I was saying is, when I worked at Apple, I do remember there was, and I was there only for about 3 years post Steve. There was almost an analysis paralysis inside of the company around what would Steve do. And it was almost formalized. Apple had something that they called Apple University. And one of the courses in Apple University was like how Steve would approach problem solving.
Not in
and
parenting.
It was, yeah, no, not in parenting. And it would, and a lot of it was really about like trying to take a living, breathing person and break them down into a set, like a rubric that you could use to approach product design or marketing or communication or what have you. And my experience of that was that it was not inspirational. It was actually quite limiting, because people were so scared that what they would do wouldn't fit within the parameters of what, granted, a once in a century genius would have done. But at the same time, like, he was gone. So it was sort of, to some degree, irrelevant. And the company that he had made was a legacy unto itself. How he chose to run it was a more personal decision. And that put the company, at least in the experience I had of it, into a state of somewhat paralysis. And I wonder sometimes, when you have a company or an artistic endeavor that is driven so heavily by one individual's personality or artistic vision or business acumen or any combination thereof, if it is possible for that business to continue in the same way as it did when that person was alive. And my thinking on that is it probably can't. And the sooner that a company can admit that, the sooner that it can potentially evolve into something beyond what that founder stood for. So when we think about, again, coming back to Rolex, for example, who knows? And I mean this with the highest regard, but like, to a certain degree, who cares what Hans Wilsdorf would really think about modern Rolex today? In the sense that the company is wildly successful, has found a voice for itself after the passing of its founder, and that voice has given way to a wildly successful business enterprise. One could argue that, if we look at whether it's a watch brand or a technology company or whatever, that if the company is able to take what has made it successful at its like core and then move past the cult of personality, that there might be a second life for that brand. And that's kind of what I'm hearing here, which is if a brand is so heavily defined as an artistic endeavor, it may not need or may not be capable of existing past its founder. If there are only 150 watches that were ever created by Creator X and that's it, and they were so magical and so esoteric and so thoughtful and so weird, is it possible for that to live on? Maybe not. Or another way to look at that might be to say, well, there was an adventurous spirit that was pioneered by this individual, and we're going to take that spirit, that idea of creativity and adventure, we're going to break away, and maybe we're going to make things that person would have never made. But we're going to take their same level of risk-taking and adventure to heart, and make something of it. And that will be what we are known for. And that's when we make the transition from being an eponymous brand to an actual manufacturer outside of that individual. And that might not be possible for everything.
That's exactly the business model for modern day Chapek, which is to draw inspiration from Francois Chapek and to continue sort of his legacy and his spirit, right? Which is interesting. But, that's an example of a resuscitation of a brand whose founder is long gone. But the approach there is exactly what you're describing, which is to say, no one is sitting around asking themselves what Francois Chapek would make today. They're just saying, how do we boil down this idea of Francois Chapek and the watches that he made in his various eras of watchmaking, the brands that he was part of creating or created himself, and how do we bring that into the modern day, right? It's more about a philosophical approach than asking yourself, what would Steve Jobs do in the particular situation I'm in, navigating a particular challenge for a business today kind of thing. But I guess, Roman, I'd love to know from your perspective, look, I really appreciate your clarity and your honesty on this point, which is and it's all about where one finds value in watches and what really moves you. And, you're moved by independent watchmaking as really an art form and a craft and an expression of creativity. Are there brands that would maybe be exceptions to what you said, which is, I think, I love that you said, I think most brands should probably, when they reach that crossroads, decide to just move on. We don't need to continue making watches with the same person's name on the dial. Like, that chapter is done. Let's find something else to do and say out there in the world and let those watches be special. Are there examples of watchmakers and brands who you think are navigating this transition in an interesting way or have navigated it in an interesting way where you're glad that they decided to keep going? Or are you universally out of hand opposed to continuing?
Okay, well, let's dive into this. Lot to cover. Firstly, just a little thing to call back to what Asher has said. When we think Rolex why do we care about whether Wilsdorf would be happy? Rolex is a successful brand. I'm not sure we know that the current Rolex is exactly what he envisaged. And were we to bring him back to show him the Rainbow Daytona and the Leopard Daytona, I'm not sure he would be proud that his name has been associated with this thing carrying on. So we don't know. So the marker of success is not necessarily, look, we've reanimated your name and it's kept products were named after you 200 years down the line. That's not necessarily the marker of success. But that's that's the one thing I wanted to say about so that's not necessarily the successful mark. I'm a big fan of letting old people just die and just respect them, but not try to re-question their, what would they have done? And we've seen that even with larger brands who often have family members on boards. I think like Audemars Piguet or AP is a classic example. Just, having the family there is not necessarily, not necessarily a useful thing because they're not necessarily their talented relative 3 generations ago. They're not necessarily any closer to knowing what they would have done. So just let them be, that kind of thing. I think of, and once again, we're talking about creative people. I think of this, a good analogy that I thought about is think of an in astronomical terms, like a supernova, right? A supernova is a star gets to a certain size and then explodes, right? It's a death of a star. But think of somebody creative, creating something really exciting, really amazing, and then essentially their creativity explodes onto the world. We can see the brightness for a certain period of time, and then it either goes, in which case we go, oh, that was, or the star never gets big enough and it sort of remains a sort of white dwarf, red dwarf. They're kind of pulsating dark body. And I see a lot of these vestigial brands of these kind of never exploded and sort of just hanging in there in space, just occupying. So I'm a big fan of just let people shine, let brands shine, and then pack it up and let somebody else have a go, or go away from the existing name. the thing you mentioned about Bremont now navigating this after Nick and Giles are gone, like it's a really interesting struggle. I like the first generation Bremont. I have a lot of time for those. I think they stay true to their roots. Like the early watch, I think the EP 120, which is still like their first watch that they made, brilliant. I still want one of those at some point. The stuff they're doing now, I'm less of a fan of, but it's actually more interesting to me is like, even if they navigate this transition, is what they end up with, is it actually a Bremont, or could they have done equally well if they called it, International British Company, IBC, why not, or something, right? Would a Bremont by another name smell as sweet as the compass that they've now got on the thing instead of their logo? Does it actually matter?
I see what you did there.
I failed because it's 7:00 in the morning, but I tried desperately to land that metaphor. In terms of questions like who has done it well, I think the best example of an independent brand managing the transition beyond the life of the maker is George Daniel. And when we think about brand, as we think like the George Daniels to Roger Smith transition is the perfect example of, we have an amazing genius, both creative and talented, and in George. He knew he was going on well. He made an X number of watches, 27 plus 4 wristwatches, whatever the number was. He created a perfect transition plan of, well, I'm not here. The person who will service these watches is this person, this guy, Roger, right? So if you've got an inquiry, he's got my tools, he's got my drawings. I've talked to him about it. He knows my technique. He will look after these watches in perpetuity, right? So this was the succession plan managed perfectly. Roger, to give him massive credit, realized, I'm not just going to continue the George Daniels name, because Roger could have easily have done George Daniels watches on the Isle of Man and Riversdale, built in the same house with George's name. But no, Roger realized it's actually much more respectful to George's name to just honor those, finish the anniversary series that he had to do, or like the 35 that's still, I think, being made now. But there was a clear delineation. But George's time has passed. I'm going to do my thing, but I'm still going to look after George's watch. I think that is the best example of an independent brand, and we say brand, which is independent maker managing that transition really well. Look, I hope in my modest way, I hope people like, Kari Voutilainen and Philippe Dufour actually heed that message. Because what I worry about from their children's perspective, and, who am I to worry about? They'll be fine. But the challenge of Daniela Dufour and Venla Voutilainen making watches under their parents' name, the Voutilainen and the Dufour name, is a losing game. Because even if both Venla and Daniela are better watchmakers than their dads were, nobody's going to care. Because if I'm ever in a position to buy a Philippe Dufour watch, I want to have the watch made by the old man, even if it's not as well made, even if the finishing is not as good. Because what I'm interested in is capturing his essence. We just happen to use both male makers, but it could easily apply for a female maker, like Eva Luba or something like that. I am much more interested in getting a watch by the founder than what Daniela and Venla are going to do. And I wish both of them the best of luck, and I want them to succeed, but I would much rather they manage a transition by when their dads have gone in 50 years' time, 60 years' time, may they both have a long and, remaining life. But when that's done, I want that brand to actually transition, to Philippe to say, when in 50 years when I'm not here, if you have my watch, Daniela will look after these for you. She knows I've trained her well. She knows she's got all my tools. She knows how to do it. But now I release her to do her own watch. And what I'm interested in is I want to see the Daniela Dufour watch, not another Simplicity.
Yeah.
And I want them to do well. So I think that's the challenge. You need the succession plan. You absolutely need a succession plan because that helps everyone, lowers everyone's anxiety. But actually, you want to release the next generation to just do what they want to do, not be shackled to this name and this particular style of watch name.
As we wind this down, this reminds me of a conversation I had with a manufacturer I have great affection for at Watches and Wonders. And I asked them, Gabe and I asked them, if you took the name of the founder off the dial and you took all of the intellectual and creative capital that came with the brand that you now have, what would you do? How would the brand manifest? How would you communicate your creative vision? What limits would you push? Where would you take it? Because what you're describing, which is a really fair point, is one could argue that a brand creates, as we pointed out earlier with IWC or Rolex or what have you, the potential for exploration within the confines of the original creator's vision to a degree. You know, pave diamonds on a Rolex notwithstanding. But if you take the kind of corny way to put it, but almost like the sort of spiritual perception of it, right? Like Philippe Dufour's fundamental belief in what it means to make a watch, but as interpreted through a completely different human being. What do you get to? And does that need to bear the Philippe Dufour marquee? Or can you simply be of the school of Philippe Dufour, as you mentioned with Roger Smith, and be able to explore new territories while still being able to pay homage to the person for whom your brand is now, or the person for whom your brand originally owes its start to? These are rhetorical questions, I appreciate, but they're interesting to ask now as the modern generation of independent watchmakers who probably have more attention on them than any cohort of independent watchmakers have had for some significant amount of time, get older and face this question of, I want to retire, or are retired for reasons that they cannot control. And people are left with their legacy and have to ask what they want to do with it. Roman, I want to thank you for, as always, being a thoughtful and provocative conversationalist. And I want to also point out for those, as I mentioned at the beginning of the pod, if you don't follow Roman on Instagram at @TimesRomanAU, or listen to his podcast, Independent Thinking, you are denying yourself a significant amount of corny memes on Instagram and fabulous insights on the podcast. And I cannot recommend it more highly.
Well, thanks for listening to Openwork. It's a production of Collective Horology. You can find us online at collectivehorology.com, and you can find our guest Roman on Instagram at @TimesRomanAU. And wherever podcasts are available and you get yours, you can, of course, listen to his podcast, Independent Thinking, on Fifth Wrist Radio. To get in touch with your comments, questions, or concerns, and Asher, you can feel free to send all your rhetorical questions here. Just email podcast@collectivehorology.com.